Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Fantasy Friday. So, last week we read chapter number 16 of the Golden Compass, in which we saw Lyra taken up by the scientists at the place she is staying, and her and Pantalaimon were very nearly separated using that fancy machinery they have set up there. Now, Mrs. Coulter just happened to walk into the room just before the procedure was taking place, and she appears to have rescued Lyra. So, let's find out what happens next because, as we recall, Lyra and Mrs. Coulter don't necessarily have the best relationship at this point. So let's find out what happens in chapter number 17, titled The Witches. Lyra moaned and trembled uncontrollably, just as if she had been pulled out of water so cold that her heart had nearly frozen. Pantalaimon simply lay against her bare skin, inside her clothes, loving her back to herself, but aware all the time of Mrs. Coulter, busy preparing a drink of something, and most of all of the golden monkey, whose hard little fingers had run swiftly over Lyra's body when only Pantalaimon could have noticed, and who had felt, around her waist, the oilskin pouch with its contents. "Sit up, dear, and drink this," said Mrs. Coulter, and her gentle arm slipped around Lyra's back and lifted her. Lyra clenched herself, but relaxed almost at once as Pantalaimon thought to her, "We're only safe as long as we pretend." She opened her eyes and found that they'd been containing tears, and to her surprise and shame, she sobbed and sobbed. Mrs. Coulter made sympathetic sounds and put the drink into the monkey's hands while she mopped Lyra's eyes with a scented handkerchief. "Cry as much as you need to, darling," said that soft voice, and Lyra determined to stop as soon as she possibly could. She struggled to hold back the tears, she pressed her lips together, she choked down the sobs that still shook her chest. Pantalaimon played the same game. Fool them, fool them. He became a mouse and crept away from Lyra's hand to sniff timidly at the drink in the monkey's clutch. It was innocuous, an infusion of chamomile, nothing more. He crept back to Lyra's shoulder and whispered, "Drink it." She sat up and took the hot cup in both hands, alternately sipping and blowing to cool it. She kept her eyes down. She must pretend harder than she'd ever done in her life. "Lyra, darling," Mrs. Coulter murmured, stroking her hair, "I thought we'd lost you forever. What happened? Did you get lost? Did someone take you out of the flat?" "Yeah," Lyra whispered. "Who was it, dear? A man and a woman? Guests at the party?" I think so. They said you needed something that was downstairs, and I went to get it, and they grabbed hold of me and took me in a car somewhere. But when they stopped, I ran out quick and dodged away, and they never caught me. But I didn't know where I was." Another sob shook her briefly, but they were weaker now, and she could pretend this one was caused by her story. And I just wandered about, trying to find my way back. Only these gobblers caught me, and they put me in a van with some other kids, and they took me somewhere, a big building. I don't know where it was." With every second that went past, with every sentence she spoke, she felt a little strength flowing back. And now that she was doing something difficult and familiar and never quite predictable, namely, lying, she felt a sort of mastery again, the same sense of complexity and control that the alethiometer gave her. She had to be careful not to say anything obviously impossible. She had to be vague in some places, and invent plausible details in others. She had to be an artist, in short. "How long did they keep you up in this building?" said Mrs. Coulter. Lyra's journey along the canals and her time with Egyptians had taken weeks. She would have to account for that time. She invented a voyage with the gobblers to Trollsund, and then an escape, lavish with details from her observation of the town, and a time as maid of all work at Einerson's bar, and then a spell working for a family of farmers inland, and then being caught by the Samoyeds and brought to Bolvangar. And they were going to cut. Hush, dear, hush. I'm going to find out what's been going on. But why are they going to do that? I never did anything wrong. All the kids are afraid of what happens in there, and no one knows. But it's horrible. It's worse than anything. Why are they doing that, Mrs. Coulter? Why are they so cruel?" "There, there. You're safe, my dear. They won't ever do it to you. Now, I know you're here, and you're safe. You'll never be in danger again. No one's going to harm you, Lyra, darling. No one's ever going to hurt you. But why? They do it to other children. Why? Ah, my love. It's dust, isn't it? Did they tell you that? Did the doctors say that? The kids know about it. All the kids talk about it, but no one knows. And they nearly done it to me. You got to tell me. You got no right to keep it secret. Not anymore. Oh, Lyra, Lyra, Lyra. Darling, these are big, difficult ideas, dust and so on. It's not something for children to worry about, but the doctors do it for the children's own good, my love. Dust is something bad, something wrong, something evil and wicked. Grown-ups and their demons are infected with dust so deeply that it's too late for them. They can't be helped, but a quick operation on children means they're safe from it. Dust just won't stick to them ever again. They're safe and happy and Lyra thought of little Tony Macarios. She leaned forward suddenly and retched. Mrs. Coulter moved back and let her go. Are you all right, dear? Go to the bathroom. Lyra swallowed hard and brushed her eyes. You don't have to do that to us, she said. You could just leave us. I bet Lord Asriel wouldn't let anyone do that if he knew what was going on. He's got dust, and you've got dust, and the Master Jordan and every other grown-up's got dust. It must be all right. When I get out, I'm going to tell all the kids in the world about this. Anyway, if it was so good, well, why'd you stop them doing it to me? If it was a good thing to do, you should have let them do it. You should have been glad. Mrs. Coulter was shaking her head and smiling, a sad, wise smile. Oh, darling, she said, some of what's good has to hurt us a little, and naturally it's upsetting for others if you're upset, but it doesn't mean your demon is taken away from you. He's still there. Oh, goodness me, a lot of the grown-ups have had the operation. The nurses seem happy enough, don't they? Lyra blinked. Suddenly she understood their strange blank in curiosity, the way their little trotting demon seemed to be sleepwalking. Say nothing, she thought, and shut her mouth hard. Oh, darling, no one would ever dream of performing an operation on a child without testing it first, Mrs. Coulter said. And no one in 1,000 years would take a child's demon away altogether. All that happens is a little cut, and then everything's peaceful. Forever. You see, your demon's a wonderful friend and companion when you're young, but at the age we call puberty, the age you're coming to very soon, darling, demons bring all sorts of troublesome thoughts and feelings, and that's what lets dust in. A quick little operation before that, and you're never troubled again. And your demon stays with you, only just not connected, like a wonderful pet, if you like. The best pet in the world. Oh, wouldn't you like that, Lyra? Oh, the wicked liar! Oh, the shameless untruths she was telling! And even if Lyra hadn't known them to be lies, Tony Macarios, those caged demons, she would have hated it with a furious passion. Her dear soul, the daring companion of her heart, to be cut away and reduced to a little trotting pet? Lyra nearly blazed with hatred, and Pantalaimon in her arms became a polecat, the most ugly and vicious of all his forms, and snarled. But they said nothing. Lyra held Pantalaimon tight and let Mrs. Coulter stroke her hair. Drink up your chamomile, said Mrs. Coulter softly. We'll have them make up a bed for you in here. There's no need to go back and share a dormitory with the other girls. Not now I've got my little assistant back. Oh, my favorite. The best assistant in the world. Oh, do you know, we searched all over London for you, darling. We had the police searching every town in the land. Oh, I missed you so much. I can't tell you how happy I am to find you again. All the time, the golden monkey was prowling about restlessly, one minute perching on the table swinging his tail, the next clinging to Mrs. Coulter and chittering softly in her ear, the next pacing the floor with tail erect. He was betraying Mrs. Coulter's impatience, of course, and finally she couldn't hold it in. Lyra, dear, she said, I think that the Master of Jordan gave you something before you left. Isn't that right? He gave you an alethiometer. The trouble is, it wasn't his to give. It was left in his care. It's really too valuable to be carried about. Do you know, it's only one of two or three in the whole world. I think the master gave it to you in the hope that it would fall into Lord Asriel's hands. He told you not to tell me about it, didn't he? Lyra twisted her mouth. Yes, I can see. Well, never mind, darling, because you didn't tell me, did you? So you haven't broken any promises. But listen, dear, it really ought to be properly looked after. I'm afraid it's so rare and delicate that we can't let it be at risk any longer. Why shouldn't Lord Asriel have it? Lyra said, not moving. Because of what he's doing. You know, he's been sent away to exile because he's got something dangerous and wicked in mind. He needs the alethiometer to finish his plan, but believe me, dear, the last thing anyone should do is let him have it. The Master of Jordan was sadly mistaken, but now that you know, it really would be better to let me have it, wouldn't it? It would save you the trouble of carrying it around and all the worry of looking after it. And it really must have been such a puzzle, wondering what a silly old thing like that was ever good for. Lyra wondered how she had ever, ever found this woman to be so fascinating and clever. So, if you've got it now, dear, you'd really better let me have it to look after. It's in that belt around your waist, isn't it? Yes, that was a clever thing to do, putting it away like that. Her hands were at Lyra's skirt, and then she was unfastening the stiff oilcloth. Lyra tensed herself. The golden monkey was crouching at the end of the bed, trembling with anticipation, little black hands to his mouth. Mrs. Coulter pulled the belt away from Lyra's waist and unbuttoned the pouch. She was breathing fast. She took out the black velvet cloth and unfolded it, finding the tin box Yorick Burnison had made. Pantalaimon was a cat again, tensed to spring. Lyra drew her legs up away from Mrs. Coulter and swung them down to the floor so that she too could run when the time came. What's this? Said Mrs. Coulter, as if amused. What a funny old tin! Did you put it in here to keep it safe, dear? All this moss! You have been careful, haven't you? Another tin inside the first one, and soldered! Who did this, dear? She was too intent on opening it to wait for an answer. She had a knife in her handbag with a lot of different attachments, and she pulled out a blade and dug it under the lid. At once, a furious buzzing filled the room. Lyra and Pantalaimon held themselves still. Mrs. Coulter, puzzled, curious, pulled at the lid, and the golden monkey bent close to look. Then, in a dazzling moment, the black form of the spy fly hurtled out of the tin and crashed hard into the monkey's face. He screamed and flung himself backward, and of course it was hurting Mrs. Coulter, too, and she cried out in pain and fright with the monkey, and then the little clockwork devil swarmed upward at her, up her breast and throat, toward her face. Lyra didn't hesitate. Pantalaimon sprang for the door, and she was after him at once, and she tore it open and raced away faster than she had ever run in her life. Fire alarm! Pantalaimon shrieked, and he flew ahead of her. She saw a button on the next corner and smashed the glass with her desperate fist. She ran on, heading toward the dormitories, smashed another alarm, and another, and then people began to come out into the corridor, looking up and down for the fire. By this time she was near the kitchen, and Pantalaimon flashed a thought into her mind, and she darted in. A moment later she had turned on all the gas taps and flung a match at the nearest burner. Then she dragged a bag of flour from a shelf and hurled it at the edge of a table, so it burst and filled the air with white, because she had heard that flour will explode if it's treated like that near a flame. Then she ran out and on as fast as she could toward her own dormitory. The corridors were full now, children running around this way and that, vivid with excitement, for the word escape had got around. The oldest were making for the storerooms where the clothing was kept, and herding the younger ones with them. Adults were trying to control it all, and none of them knew what was happening. Shouting, pushing, crying, jostling people were everywhere. Through it all, Lyra and Pantalaimon darted like fish, making always for the dormitory, and, just as they reached it, there was a dull explosion from behind that shook the building. The other girls had fled. The room was empty. Lyra dragged the locker to the corner, jumped up, hauled the furs out of the ceiling, felt for the alethiometer. It was still there. She tugged the furs on quickly, pulling the hood forward, and then Pantalaimon, a sparrow at the door, called, "Now!" She ran out. By luck, a group of children who had already found some cold weather clothing were racing down the corridor toward the main entrance, and she joined them, sweating, her heart thumping, knowing that she had to escape or die. The way was blocked. The fire in the kitchen had taken quickly, and whether it was the flour or the gas, something had brought down part of the roof. People were clambering over twisted struts and girders to get up to the bitter cold air. The smell of gas was strong. Then came another explosion, louder than the first, and closer. The blast knocked several people over, and cries of fear and pain filled the air. Lyra struggled up, and with Pantalaimon calling, "This way! This way!" among the other demon cries and flutterings, she hauled herself over the rubble. The air she was breathing was frozen, and she hoped that the children had managed to find their outdoor clothing. It would be a fine thing to escape from the station, only to die of cold. There really was a blaze now. When she got out onto the roof under the night sky, she could see flames licking at the edges of a great hole in the side of the building. There was a throng of children and adults by the main entrance, but this time the adults were more agitated and the children more fearful. Much more fearful. "Roger! Roger!" Lyra called, and Pantalaimon, keen-eyed as an owl, hooted that he'd seen him. A moment later, they found each other. "Tell them all to come with me," Lyra shouted into his ear. They won't. They're all panicky. Tell them what they Tell them what they do to the kids that vanish. They cut their demons off with a big knife. Tell them what you saw this afternoon. All them demons we let out. Tell them that's going to happen to them too, unless they get away." Roger gaped, horrified, but then collected his wits and ran to the nearest group of hesitating children. Lyra did the same, and as the message passed along, some children cried out and clutched their demons in fear. "Come with me!" Lyra shouted. "There's a rescue coming! We've got to get outside the compound! Come on, run!" The children heard her and followed, streaming across the enclosure toward the avenue of lights, their boots pattering and creaking in the hard packed snow. Behind them, adults were shouting, and there was a rumble and crash as another part of the building fell in. Sparks gushed into the air, and flames billowed out with a sound like tearing cloth. But cutting through this came another sound, dreadfully close and violent. Lyra had never heard it before, but she knew it at once. It was the howl of the Tartar guards' wolf demons. She felt weak from head to foot, and many children turned in fear and stumbled to a stop, for there, running at a low, swift, tireless lope, came the first of the Tartar guards, rifle at ready, with the mighty leaping grayness of his demon beside him. Then came another, and another. They were all in padded mail, and they had no eyes, or at least you couldn't see any eyes behind the snow slits of their helmets. The only eyes you could see were the round black ends of the rifle barrels and the blazing yellow eyes of the wolf demons above the slaver dripping from their jaws. Lyra faltered. She hadn't dreamed of how frightening those wolves were, and now that she knew how casually people at Bolvangar broke the great taboo, she shrank from the thought of those dripping teeth. The Tartars ran to stand in a line across the entrance to the Avenue of Lights, their demons beside them as disciplined and drilled as they were. In another minute there'd be a second line, because more were coming, and more behind them. Lyra thought with despair, children can't fight soldiers. It wasn't like the battles in the Oxford clay beds, hurling lumps of mud at the brick burners' children. Or perhaps it was. She remembered hurling a handful of clay in the broad face of a brick burner boy bearing down on her. He'd stopped to claw the stuff out of his eyes, and then the townies leaped on him. She'd been standing in the mud. Now she was standing in the snow. Just as she had done that afternoon, but in deadly earnest now. She scooped a handful together and hurled it at the nearest soldier. "Get him in the eyes!" she yelled, and threw another. Other children joined in, and then someone's demon had the notion of flying as a swift beside the snowball and nudging it directly at the eye slits of the target. And then they all joined in, and in a few moments the Tartars were stumbling about, spitting and cursing and trying to brush the packed snow out of the narrow gap in front of their eyes. "Come on!" Lyra screamed, and flung herself at the gate into the avenue of lights. The children streamed after her, every one, dodging the snapping jaws of the wolves and racing as hard as they could down the avenue toward the beckoning open dark beyond. A harsh scream came from behind as an officer shouted an order, and then a score of rifle bolts worked at once, and then there was another scream and a tense silence, with only the fleeing children's pounding feet and gasping breath to be heard. They were taking aim. They wouldn't miss. But before they could fire, a choking gasp came from one of the Tartars, and a cry of surprise from another. Lyra stopped and turned to see a man lying on the snow with a gray feathered arrow in his back. He was writhing and twitching and coughing out blood, and the other soldiers were looking around to left and right for whoever had fired it, but the archer was nowhere to be seen. And then an arrow came flying straight down from the sky and struck another man behind the head. He fell at once. A shout from the officer, and everyone looked up at the dark sky. "Witches!" said Pantalaimon. And so they were. Ragged, elegant black shapes sweeping past high above, with a hiss and swish of air through the needles of the cloud pine branches they flew on. As Lyra watched, one swooped low and loosed an arrow. Another man fell. And then all the Tartars turned their rifles up and blazed into the dark, firing at nothing, at shadows, at clouds, and more arrows rained down on them. But the officer in charge, seeing the children almost away, ordered a squad to race after them. Some children screamed, and then more screamed, and they weren't moving forward anymore. They were turning back in confusion, terrified by the monstrous shape hurtling toward them from the dark beyond the avenue of lights. "Yorick Burnison!" cried Lyra, her chest nearly bursting with joy. The armored bear at the charge seemed to be conscious of no weight except what gave him momentum. He bounded past Lyra almost in a blur and crashed into the Tartars, scattering soldiers, demons, rifles to all sides. Then he stopped and whirled round, with a lithe athletic power, and struck two massive blows, one to each side, at the guards closest to him. A wolf demon leaped at him. He slashed at her in midair, and bright fire spilled out of her as she fell to the snow, where she hissed and howled before vanishing. Her human died at once. The Tartar officer, faced with this double attack, did not hesitate. A long, high scream of orders, and the force divided itself into two, one to keep off the witches, the bigger part to overcome the bear. His troops were magnificently brave. They dropped to one knee in groups of four, and fired their rifles as if they were on the practice range, not budging an inch as Yorick's mighty bulk hurtled toward them. A moment later, they were dead. Yorick struck again, twisting to one side, slashing, snarling, crushing, while bullets flew about him like wasps or flies, doing no harm at all. Lyra urged the children on and out into the darkness beyond the lights. They must get away, because dangerous as the Tartars were, far more dangerous were the adults of Bolvangar. So she called and beckoned and pushed to get the children moving. As the lights behind them threw long shadows on the snow, Lyra found her heart moving out toward the deep dark of the Arctic night and the clean coldness, leaping forward to love it as Pantalaimon was doing, a hare now delighting in his own propulsion. "Where are we going?" "There's nothing out there but snow." "There's a rescue party coming," Lyra told them. "There's 50 Egyptians or more. I bet there's some relations of yours, too. All the Egyptian families that lost a kid, they all sent someone." "I ain't Egyptian," a boy said. "It doesn't matter. They'll take you anyway." "Where?" someone said querulously. "Home," said Lyra. "That's what I come for, to rescue you, and I brung the Egyptians here to take you home again. We just gotta go on a bit further, and then we'll find 'em. The bear was with 'em, so they can't be far off." "Do you see that bear?" one boy was saying. "When he slashed open that demon, the man died as if someone whipped his heart out, just like that." "I never knew demons could be killed," someone else said. They were all talking now. The excitement and relief had loosened everyone's tongue. As long as they kept moving, it didn't matter if they talked. "Is it true," said a girl, "about what they do back there?" "Yeah," Lyra said. "I never thought I'd see anyone without their demon, but on the way here, we found this boy on his own without any demon at all. He kept asking for her where she was, would she ever find him. He was called Tony Macarios." "I know him," said someone, and others joined in. "Yeah, they took him away about a week back." "Well, they cut his demon away," said Lyra, knowing how it would affect them. "And a little bit after we found him, he died. And all the demons they cut away, they kept them in cages in a square building back there. It's true, said Roger. And Lyra let him out during the fire drill. Yeah, I seen 'em, said Billy Costa. I didn't know what they was at first, but I seen 'em fly away with that goose. But why did they do it? Demanded one boy. Why did they cut people's demons away? That's torture. Why did they do it? Dust, probably, suggested someone, doubtfully. But the boy laughed in scorn. Ha! Dust! He said. There ain't no such thing. They just made that up. I don't believe in it. Here, said someone else. Look what's happening to the Zeppelin. They all looked back. Beyond the dazzle of lights, where the fight was still continuing, the great length of the airship was not floating freely at the mooring mast any longer. The free end was drooping downward, and beyond it was rising a globe of Lee Scoresby's balloon! Lyra cried, and clapped her mittened hands with delight. The other children were baffled. Lyra herded them onward, wondering how the aeronaut had got his balloon that far. It was clear what he was doing, and what a good idea to fill his balloon with the gas out of theirs, to escape by the same means that crippled their pursuit. Come on, keep moving, or else you'll freeze, she said, for some of the children were shivering and moaning from the cold, and their demons were crying too in high, thin voices. Pantalaimon found this irritating, and, as a wolverine, he snapped at one girl's squirrel demon who was just lying across her shoulder, whimpering faintly. Get it in her coat! Make yourself big and warm her up! He snarled, and the girl's demon, frightened, crept inside her coal silk anorak at once. The trouble was that coal silk wasn't as warm as proper fur, no matter how much it was padded out with hollow coal silk fibers. Some of the children looked like walking puffballs, they were so bulky, but their gear had been made in factories and laboratories far away from the cold, and it couldn't really cope. Lyra's furs looked ragged and they stank, but they kept the warmth in. If we don't find the Egyptians soon, they ain't gonna last, she whispered to Pantalaimon. Keep 'em moving then, he whispered back. If they lie down, they're finished. You know what Farder Coram said. Farder Coram had told many tales of his own journeys in the north, and so had Mrs. Coulter, always supposing that hers were more true. But they were both quite clear about one point, which was that you must keep going. How far we gotta go? Said a little boy. She's just making us walk out here to kill us, said a girl. Rather be out here than back there, someone said. I wouldn't. It's warm back in the station. There's food and hot drinks and everything. But it's all on fire. Well, what are we going to do out here? I bet we starve to death. Lyra's mind was full of dark questions that flew around like witches. Swift and untouchable, and somewhere, just beyond where she could reach, there was a glory and a thrill which she didn't understand at all. But it gave her a surge of strength, and she hauled one girl up out of a snowdrift, and shoved at a boy who was dawdling, and called to them all, Keep going! Follow the bear's tracks! He come up with the Egyptians, and so the tracks will lead us to where they are. Just keep walking! Big flakes of snow were beginning to fall. Soon it would have covered Yorick Burnison's tracks altogether. Now that they were out of sight of the lights of Bolvangar, and the blaze of the fire was only a faint glow, the only light came from the faint radiance of the snow-covered ground. Thick clouds obscured the sky, so there was neither moon nor northern lights. But, by peering closely, the children could make out the deep trail Yorick Burnison had plowed in the snow. Lyra encouraged, bullied, hit, half-carried, swore at, pushed, dragged, lifted tenderly, wherever it was needed, and Pantalaimon, by the state of each child's demon, told her what was needed in each case. I'll get them there, she kept saying to herself. I come here to get 'em, and I'll bloody get 'em. Roger was following her example, and Billy Costa was leading the way, being sharper-eyed than most. Soon the snow was falling so thickly that they had to cling on to one another to keep from getting lost, and Lyra thought, perhaps if we all lie close and keep warm like that, dig holes in the snow, maybe. She was hearing things. There was the snarl of an engine somewhere, not the heavy thump of a zeppelin, but something higher like the drone of a hornet. It drifted in and out of hearing. And howling. Dogs? Sledge dogs? That, too, was distant and hard to be sure of, blanketed by millions of snowflakes and blown this way and that by little puffing gusts of wind. It might have been the Egyptian sledge dogs, or it might have been wild spirits of the tundra, or even those freed demons crying for their lost children. She was seeing things. There weren't any lights in the snow, were there? They must be ghosts as well, unless they'd come round in a circle and were stumbling back into Bolvangar. But these were little yellow lantern beams, not the white glare of anbaric lights. And they were moving, and the howling was nearer, and before she knew for certain whether she had fallen asleep, Lyra was wandering among familiar figures, and men in furs were holding her up. John Faw's mighty arm lifted her clear of the ground, and Farder Coram was laughing with pleasure. And as far through the blizzard as she could see, Egyptians were lifting children into sledges, covering them with furs, giving them seal meat to chew. And Tony Costa was there, hugging Billy, and then punching him softly, only to hug him again and shake him for joy. And Roger, "Roger's coming with us," said Farder Coram. Yeah, Roger, it was him I meant to get in the first place. We'll go back to Jordan in the end. What's that noise?" It was that snarl again, that engine, like a crazed spy fly 10,000 times the size. Suddenly there came a blow that sent her sprawling, and Pantalaimon couldn't defend her, because the golden monkey, Mrs. Coulter. The golden monkey was wrestling, biting, scratching at Pantalaimon, who was flickering through so many changes of form it was hard to see him, and fighting back, stinging, lashing, tearing. Mrs. Coulter, meanwhile, her face in its furs a frozen glare of intense feeling, was dragging Lyra to the back of a motorized sledge, and Lyra struggled as hard as her demon. The snow was so thick that they seemed to be isolated in a little blizzard of their own, and the anbaric headlights of the sledge only showed up the thick swirling flakes a few inches ahead. "Help!" Lyra cried to the Egyptians who were just there in the blinding snow, and who could see nothing. "Help me! Farder Coram! Lord Fa! Oh God, help me!" Mrs. Coulter shrieked a high command in the language of the northern Tartars. The snow swirled open, and there they were, a squad of them, armed with rifles, and the wolf demons snarled beside them. The chief saw Mrs. Coulter struggling, and picked up Lyra with one hand as if she were a doll, and threw her into the sledge, where she lay stunned and dazed. A rifle banged, and then another, as the Egyptians realized what was happening. But firing at targets you can't see is dangerous when you can't see your own side either. The Tartars, in a tight group now around the sledge, were able to blaze at will into the snow, but the Egyptians dared not shoot back for fear of hitting Lyra. Oh, the bitterness she felt, the tiredness. Still dazed, with her head ringing, she hauled herself up to find Pantalaimon desperately fighting the monkey still, with wolverine jaws fastened tight on a golden arm, changing no more, but grimly hanging on. And who was that? Surely not Roger. Yes, Roger, battering at Mrs. Coulter with fists and feet, hurtling his head against hers, only to be struck down by a Tartar who swiped at him like someone brushing away a fly. It was all a phantasmagoria now. White, black, a swift green flutter across her vision, ragged shadows, racing light. A great swirl lifted curtains of snow aside, and into the cleared area leaped Yorick Burnison, with a clang and screech of iron on iron. A moment later, and those great jaws snapped left, right, a paw ripped open a mailed chest, white teeth, black iron, red, wet fur. Then something was pulling her up, powerfully up. And she seized Roger too, tearing him out of the hands of Mrs. Coulter, and clinging tight, each child's demon a shrill bird fluttering in amazement as a greater fluttering swept all around them. And then Lyra saw in the air beside her a witch, one of those elegant ragged black shadows from the high air, but close enough to touch. And there was a bow in the witch's bare hands, and she exerted her pale, bare arms, in this freezing air, to pull the string and then loose an arrow into the eye slit of a mailed and lowering Tartar hood, only 3 feet away. And the arrow sped in and halfway out the back, and the man's wolf demon vanished in mid leap, even before he caught the ground. Up! Into midair, Lyra and Roger were caught and swept, and found themselves clinging with weakening fingers to a cloud pine branch, where a young witch was sitting tense with balanced grace. And then she leaned down and to the left, and something huge was looming, and there was the ground. They tumbled into the snow beside the basket of Lee Scoresby's balloon. "Skip inside!" called the Texan. "And bring your friend, by all means. Have you seen that bear?" Lyra saw that three witches were holding a rope looped around a rock, anchoring the great buoyancy of the gas bag to the earth. "Get in!" she cried to Roger, and scrambled over the leather-bound rim of the basket to fall in a snowy heap inside. A moment later, Roger fell on top of her, and then a mighty noise halfway between a roar and a growl made the very ground shake. "Come on, Yorick! On board, old feller!" yelled Lee Scoresby, and over the side came the bear in a hideous creak of wicker and bending wood. At once the aeronaut lowered his arm in a signal, and the witches let go of the rope. The balloon lifted immediately and surged upward into the snow-thick air at a rate Lyra could scarcely believe. After a moment, the ground disappeared in the mist, and up they went, faster and faster, so that she thought no rocket could have left the earth more swiftly. She lay holding on to Roger on the floor of the basket, pressed down by the acceleration. Lee Scoresby was cheering and laughing and uttering wild Texan yells of delight. Yorick Burnison was calmly unfastening his armor, hooking a deft claw into all the linkages and undoing them with a twist before packing the separate pieces in a pile. Somewhere outside, the flap and swish of air through cloud pine needles and witch garments told that the witches were keeping them company into the upper airs. Little by little, Lyra recovered her breath, her balance, and her heartbeat. She sat up and looked around. The basket was much bigger than she had thought. Ranged around the edges were racks of philosophical instruments, and there were small piles of furs, and bottled air, and a variety of other things too small or confusing to make out in the thick mist they were ascending through. "Is this a cloud?" she said. "Sure is. Wrap your friend in some furs before he turns into an icicle. It's cold here, but it's gonna get colder." How did you find us?" "Witches. There's one witch lady wants to talk to you. When we get clear of the cloud, we'll get our bearings, and then we can sit and have a yarn." Yorick," said Lyra, "thank you for coming." The bear grunted, and settled down to lick the blood off his fur. His weight meant that the basket was tilted to one side, but that didn't matter. Roger was wary, but Yorick Burnison took no more notice of him than of a flake of snow. Lyra contented herself with clinging to the rim of the basket, just under her chin when she was standing, and peering wide-eyed into the swirling cloud. Only a few seconds later, the balloon passed out of the cloud altogether, and, still rising rapidly, soared on into the heavens. What a sight! Directly above them, the balloon swelled out in a huge curve. Above and ahead of them, the aurora was blazing, with more brilliance and grandeur than she had ever seen. It was all around, or nearly, and they were nearly part of it. Great swaths of incandescence trembled and parted like angels' wings beating. Cascades of luminescent glory tumbled down invisible crags to lie in swirling pools or hang like vast waterfalls. So Lyra gasped at that, and then she looked below, and saw a sight almost more wondrous. As far as the eye could see, to the very horizon in all directions, a tumbled sea of white extended without a break. Soft peaks and vaporous chasms rose or opened here and there, but mostly it looked like a solid mass of ice. And rising through it in ones and twos and larger groups as well came small black shadows, those ragged figures of such elegance, witches on their branches of cloud pine. They flew swiftly, without any effort, up and toward the balloon, leaning to one side or another to steer. And one of them, the archer who had saved Lyra from Mrs. Coulter, flew directly alongside the basket, and Lyra saw her clearly for the first time. She was young, younger than Mrs. Coulter, and fair, with bright green eyes, and clad like all the witches in strips of black silk, but wearing no furs, no hood, or mittens. She seemed to feel no cold at all. Around her brow was a simple chain of little red flowers. She sat on her cloud pine branch as if it were a steed, and seemed to rein it in a yard from Lyra's wondering gaze. "Lyra?" Yes, and are you Seraphina Pecola?" "I am." Lyra could see why Farder Coram loved her, and why it was breaking his heart, though she had known neither of those things a moment before. He was growing old. He was an old, broken man, and she would be young for generations. "Have you got the symbol reader?" said the witch, in a voice so like the high, wild singing of the aurora itself that Lyra could hardly hear her the sense of the sweet sound of it. Yeah, I got it in my pocket, safe. Great wing beats told of another arrival, and then he was gliding beside her, the gray goose demon. He spoke briefly, and then wheeled away to glide in the wide circle around the balloon as it continued to rise. The Egyptians have laid waste to Bolvangar, said Seraphina Pekkala. They have killed 22 guards and 9 of the staff, and they've set alight to every part of the building that still stood. They are going to destroy it completely. What about Mrs. Coulter? Lyra asked. No sign of her. And the kids? And they got all the kids safely? Every one of them. They are all safe. Seraphina Pekkala cried out in a wild yell, and other witches circled and flew in toward the balloon. Mr. Scoresby, she said, the rope, if you please. Oh, ma'am, I'm very grateful. We're still rising. I guess we'll go on up a while yet. How many of you will take to pull us north? We are strong, was all she said. Lee Scoresby was attaching a coil of stout rope to the leather-covered iron ring that gathered the ropes running over the gas bag, and from which the basket itself was suspended. When it was securely fixed, he threw the free end out, and at once 6 witches darted toward it, caught hold, and began to pull, urging the cloud pine branches toward the polar star. As the balloon began to move in that direction, Pantalaimon came to perch on the edge of the basket as a turn. Roger's demon came out to look, but crept back again soon, for Roger was fast asleep, as was Yorick Burnison. Only Lee Scoresby was awake, calmly chewing a thin cigar and watching his instruments. So, Lyra, said Seraphina Pekkala, do you know why you're going to Lord Asriel? Lyra was astonished. To take on the alethiometer, of course, she said. She had never really considered the question. It was obvious. Then she recalled her first motive, from so long ago that she had almost forgotten it. To help him escape. That's it. Yeah, we're gonna help him get away. But as she said that, it sounded absurd. Escape from Svalbard? Impossible. We're gonna try anyway, Lyra added, stoutly. Why? I think there are things I need to tell you, said Seraphina Pekkala. About dust? Lyra asked. It was the first thing Lyra wanted to know. Yes, among other things. But you are tired now, and it will be a long flight. We'll talk when you wake up. Lyra yawned. It was a jaw-cracking, lung-bursting yawn that lasted almost a minute, or felt like it, and, for all that Lyra struggled, she couldn't resist the onrush of sleep. Seraphina Pekkala reached a hand over the rim of the basket and touched her eyes, and, as Lyra sank to the floor, Pantalaimon fluttered down, changed to an ermine, and crawled to his sleeping place by her neck. The witch settled her branch into a steady speed beside the basket as they moved north towards Svalbard. And so concludes chapter number 17 of The Golden Compass. So, lots of action happening in that one. We had Lyra talking briefly with Mrs. Coulter, and Mrs. Coulter prying into places she shouldn't have been, places she had no business to go. And she found the oilskin pouch in which Lyra normally keeps the alethiometer. Fortunately, the alethiometer was not in there this time. She had only the spy fly in that little tin that Yorick Burnison had prepared for her earlier. And Mrs. Coulter broke into that and found the spy fly. Now, of course, she was the one who had sent the spy fly to seek out Lyra in the first place. So at that point, Lyra and Pantalaimon had to run away. So they ran away, smashed all the fire alarms, and Lyra did a little science experiment as well, which, some teachers will do in the classroom, or just, you could look it up online as well, where if you take white flour in its powder form and you throw it into the air, it catches on fire incredibly easily. It's very flammable in that little powdery form. So what she did was she ran into the kitchen, turned on all the gas, lit a match, and threw flour into the air. Of course, that caught on fire and caused a massive explosion. And with the explosion, they were able to escape and get all the kids outside and running away. At which point, luckily, we had the witches show up and also the Egyptians with Yorick Burnison, who managed to gather up all the kids and rescue them from Mrs. Coulter and the other adults. And then everyone kind of came back together. We have Lee Scoresby and his balloon. We have Serafina Pekkala with all the witches. And now they're all moving north in the hot air balloon. So, kind of a cool turn of events. And it sounds like Serafina Pekkala, the witch with the Grey Goose Demon, has a few things to say to Lyra. So, we'll have to see what comes next in the next chapter of The Golden Compass. So, stick around and come back next week, same time, same place, to find out what happens then. I look forward to seeing you all. Until then, enjoy your weekend. Bye now.